Good morning, good afternoon, depending where you're at. And this is a special episode what we're doing here of ENN Network. And it's going to be a great conversation. And I'm going to bring Mike into the show. Hey, Michael, how you doing?
Hey, Todd, how are you?
I'm doing well. So I know that you have a special plan set for us. So what happens when your emergency management plan fails? And I'm here to learn. So tell us how it happens, Mike.
Great. Thanks, Todd. So I built this presentation deck for a conference of managers in a very specific non-emergency management field. They had additional clients' needs, but I found out that sort of the overall what they needed could be applicable to just about any organization. So this presentation is about both continuity of operations internally and also how we all have a role in helping others during disasters. So I wanted to share it with others as a recorded presentation. I think it's a pretty good overview for non-emergency management leaders in organizations which are not emergency management focused. That is, of what our principles as emergency managers, our mantras, our doctrine, and all that stuff is all about. So this presentation is for those folks, those groups, those organizations who think they either have a basic emergency action plan and want to see if it covers all of their needs and where they can improve it, as well as for the folks who think that their organizations don't have any emergency management plans at all. So from the title, What Happens When Your Emergency Plans Fail? It's a pretty simple answer. And I could really do this presentation in one slide. The answer to the question of what happens when your emergency plans fail is your organization fails. It fails at life safety, it fails at stabilizing the incident, and it fails at protecting property and other assets. Is everybody okay with that? Nah, I didn't think so. What happens when your main emergency actions plans fail in any way, or your plan was to have no plan and leave this to someone else to solve, is that you need to activate your set of backup plans and backup plans to those backup plans. Today, I'm going to help you take what you have now and talk about how you're going to go through a complex process of review, refinement, and hopefully continuous improvement. We're not going to cross any mountains today, but you will hopefully have a better understanding of what it takes for you and your organization to get over a hill or two and get through any disaster anytime and anywhere. So hi folks, this is me. I'm a certified emergency manager and a former director of disaster services at the Red Cross, as well as a former assistant director at the New Jersey Department of Children and Families Office of Emergency Management. I've been in the disaster readiness business for more than 15 years, and now I run my own consulting firm where we help others with their own planning, staffing, equipment and systems usage, training, and exercising. I still volunteer with the Red Cross, primarily supporting FEMA for their coordination with New York, New Jersey, Puerto Rico, and the U.S. Virgin Islands, specifically for mass care issues, which include supporting people with disabilities and access and functional needs impacted by federally declared disasters and emergencies. I also lead the Center for Emergency Management Intelligence Research, which has a blog section on the Emergency Management Network. You can find a good chunk of my emergency management rants and raves on the CEMER section at that site. So I'd like to ask folks viewing this presentation to think of themselves for two questions. First, to better understand where their own organization is on the disaster readiness scale. And the choices are needs help, starting to help ourselves, fully able to help ourselves, and then finally starting to help others. And second, to recognize what type of organization you represent. Are you in a for-profit business, a nonprofit organization, or a governmental organization? And whether you and your organization have a responsibility to help support the public in a disaster. Disasters take a whole of community effort to respond and recover from, and they need that same whole of community effort to prepare for and mitigate against as well. In other words, we're all in this mess together. So right from the start, some apologies. I'm a fast talker from New Jersey, and I tend to go pretty acronym speak quickly. Todd, please interrupt me if I need to slow down or if there's something I said which was unclear. I once did an online webinar from folks who live in another, let's say, laid-back state, mostly. While I was presenting, their leader was texting me to slow down, saying I was talking too fast. Then my boss texted me that they were getting texts from that leader to tell me to slow down too. Also, I'm going to use the term disaster and emergency fairly interchangeably. Crises, emergencies, disasters, incidents, catastrophes, they can all mean different things to different people. Today, we're going to talk about what adversely can impact you and your organization, whether or not the rest of the public or even your next door neighbor is impacted. Try not to focus on the massive amounts and depths of threats out there, but rather focus on the specific hazards, which are those adverse impacts which can produce to you and your organization trouble. You will soon see how it will boil down to a minimum number of choices of actions to take, and ones that should be repeated, normalized, and exercised frequently. So Todd, I think you would probably say there's some folks out there that might need a big fit for this.
Yeah, so Mike, I imagine that we have some folks who need some 30,000 foot level setting, and maybe emergency management isn't their everyday job or work, and maybe they're not even clear on what emergency management or what EM truly means.
Yeah, well, I need another hour to try to explain what I think emergency management is and what it isn't. But I'll do a couple of level setting slides, which will definitely help in this presentation. And hopefully will also help those who do in fact work in EM align with what I'm presenting today. Emergency managers, which could also be abbreviated as EMs or even OEMs, that's just an Office of Emergency Management. We think along different organizational constructs, and most importantly, different priorities. EMs prioritize in this specific order: life safety, incident stabilization, and then property asset protection. Anyone need an example of how this works differently than in their normal governmental and corporate world? Well, you might know that the governor or tribal leader can declare an emergency statewide or in their sovereign tribal nation, which can do things like order trucks off state and federal highways, right? The governor in most cases actually authorizes their Secretary of Transportation to make this order, and it generally gets enforced by their state police or maybe even in their National Guard. That's a case where life safety of the truck drivers and everyone else left on the road is placed higher than the property asset protection, the commerce or movement of goods across the state. Anytime an organization puts its priorities of actions in this three-level order of priorities, even when they themselves are adversely impacted, and it needs to change their own management structure to do this, then they're utilizing emergency management. And by the way, when you do change your organizational model to one that uses EM, not only are you prioritizing safety, people over profits, as the kids like to say, you're also aligning with state and federal regulations, insurance carrier requirements, etc. Your actions as a leader are much more defensible when you prioritize life safety first. There's a lot of dimensions to EM. What's good is that they're repeatable and fairly consistent in its comprehensiveness. As I said before, whether we call them emergencies, disasters, crises, incidents, or whatever, the work is still the same, only different for size and scope. A building fire may be a disaster for you, but not necessarily one for me.
So Michael, for emergency action plans, what should they cover and when?
So academically, we divide disasters into two rows: notice versus notice, and 4 columns. And these, by the way, are the threat types: natural, human-made, product, process, and fictitious. Each of these threat types can be notice or no notice. Finally, there's one more row, which is complex disasters, which can combine multiple threat types and or multiple occurrences of the same threat type for the same jurisdiction. They can be no notice or notice as well. The January 6th attack at the U.S. Capitol back in 2021 was a notice complex coordinated attack disaster. And while that's my opinion of that incident, I'm not the only one with it. When Superstorm Sandy hit the Northeast back in 2012, the fire that destroyed a huge section of Breezy Point, Queens, and a separate fire that consumed Maniloking, New Jersey, those were part of a complex disaster. You could say the storm was a notice incident, but those fires certainly were not.
And this is just a disaster, a set of threats, right? So we certainly need plans for all these, but we also should be planning for events as well. But what happens if there's a disaster that occurs at the event?
Yeah, every organization should think about events near or possibly impacting your own organization sites or the people who work with you. You need to think about what if something bad happens at an event, and also what if something goes wrong in an incident or disaster too. Recall the fires during the hurricane. That's what's called consequence management planning, which we'll cover in a moment or two. Think about where your organization is located, and then think about the flooding impacts to that site. Or what if a sudden severe winter storm were to come about? Or what if your work was, say, in downtown Charlottesville, Virginia, around August 11th, 2017? How would you work around civil protests, which then turned into riots and domestic violent extremist attacks? While most events are scheduled, some can be spontaneous, and most do not need to be managed in real time by emergency responders, but they all should have some element of emergency response and recovery planning and preparedness. Large-scale events can be planned using EM. For example, national sporting events and the presidential inaugurations are all planned using an EM construct, which includes consequence management planning. Incidents can occur at events or on their own. And I believe, and I think history backs me up on this, that when incidents are not managed through a comprehensive emergency management system that is communicative, collaborative, cooperative, and coordinated, they get much worse before they get better.
So, as for when, isn't it having a response plan for during enough?
Definitely not. Disasters are managed through a process we call the disaster phase cycle. FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, describes them in a linear process with some overlaps. They use terms like left and right of boom to describe the work before and after an incident occurs, in many ways as if it was a short-term set of adverse impacts. Earthquakes and tornadoes go through a community in a matter of minutes. Hurricanes take hours and even days. Well, COVID-19 kind of changed all of that. And we had both a global pandemic, one where no nation was immune from its adverse impacts, and one where every state, territory, and sovereign tribal nation had simultaneously declared a disaster for the first time in our U.S. history. Now, we find ourselves not in a two-dimensional linear process, but more of a three-dimensional spiral. One where we can be in response at the same time we're in preparedness, at the same time we're in recovery and mitigation. What's the name of that award-winning movie, Everything Everywhere All at Once? Well, we prefer to view disaster readiness or resiliency across the disaster phase cycle as more of a magnifying glass where you can focus your efforts and planning in one area, a bunch of areas, or the whole metaverse everywhere all at once. The plans for responding are different than the plans for mitigation. The training is different, etc. But all of these before, during, and after phases are needed to get through disasters. Think of it as 3 phases, but with 5 names.
Sounds very academic. Reminds me of project management styles. Is there one that's used to EM to address the gap of missing or insufficient action plans? In other words, do EM folks know how to systematically fix this?
Yes, and we follow a bit of the agile model by using a workflow which has its own acronym, POETE, which stands for planning, organizing, equipping, training, and exercising. I made this slide with all the ING words. You might hear it as plans, organization, equipment, training, and exercises too. So while this presentation was titled, What Happens When Your Plans Fail? It could also be what happens when your planning fails, or when your organization or the disaster roles you establish for your staff fails, or your systems fail in your disaster recovery, or even if your training for preparedness fails. Wait, that's what I'm doing right now. Oops. The point I'm trying to get across is this is multidimensional. You need the POETI for every phase of the disaster cycle. So it's a series of plans, a series of training, a series of exercises. And I mentioned FEMA earlier, and they have a pretty good structure for the O in organization of EM roles for response and recovery. Many states and local jurisdictions use the same incident command system, or ICS, as do many organizations who function in disasters. Maybe not this exact one, but generally something pretty close. At the top is the incident commander, the person in charge, or sometimes it's a team of expert leaders, depending upon the disaster. A wildfire is one thing, an earthquake or a cyber attack is another. That leadership also has direct support from a public information officer who helps coordinate the messaging to the public and others outside of the command structure. There's a safety officer whose sole function it is to make sure everyone's working the incident is kept safe. Our society needs these folks again and again to respond and recover from the next disaster and the one after that and so forth. And then there are liaison officers, staff who represent other command structures. For example, on many major disasters, the electric companies will have their own command systems, and it's the liaison officer who bridges one ICS to another. This, by the way, is what I do as a volunteer between the Red Cross and other mass care groups in FEMA for Region 2. Then at the bottom, there's colored boxes which represent the different functions needed in EM. And it's not just operations, but it's finance and admin who help pay for and account for the work performed. Logistics, the staff, stuff, systems, and sites involved. Planning, and even intelligence. You should think about who can fill all of these roles in your organization to support the disasters of any kind which you may experience.
So is the point here for organizations to become response organizations, or is it just to organize themselves to align with other response organizations?
I think it's the latter, with the caveat that the first people to help on a no-notice incident are your own people. As FEMA likes to say, you're the help until help arrives. So establishing, training, and exercising your own emergency action teams for all of your sites is the best way to help with the organization's priorities when disasters strike. As an emergency manager, as thinking about it as things as an emergency manager, you are going to have a number of priorities to be concerned with. It bears repeating. First and foremost is life safety. Then it's incident stabilization. Then it's property asset protection. After all three of these come the continuity of operations or continuity of government. If your building is on fire, you get everyone out to a safer place and account for them. You don't wait for the fire department to do this for you, period. If you remember to close some doors behind you when you leave, that can help keep the fire contained. You certainly do not go back in to do that. If you get a chance to grab your go bag on the way out, even better. And if that bag has a clipboard with staff, client, and other critical info, plus a flash drive with backups of critical files, etc., well, you're batting 1,000. Some of this is social re-engineering. Ever notice how on airplanes the flight attendants tell you to put on your oxygen mask first before helping put them on others like your kids? Well, what they don't say is that you can't help someone else if you're passed out yourself. But that's what they are doing, is they're social re-engineering. The primordial urge that we have to help our families first. As emergency managers, we need to keep those priorities in mind in all of our actions, especially as we switch our hats from day-to-day steady state managers to emergency managers, and then possibly to roles as continuity element managers. Continuity is part of recovery. It's standing up alternate logistics elements, the sites, staff, stuff, and systems needed to keep your operation going somewhere else. And how there has to be a different team working on restoring your steady state logistics as well. And finally, how you need a devolution plan with those same types of consequence management what-ifs included. Many municipalities have devolution plans to their respective counties. If you want, see the New Jersey's Camden City Police Department for an example of this. The county took over that city's police department on May 1st of 2013. Counties devolved some of their emergency management operations to the state during declared disasters. I mentioned that before when they became overwhelmed or sometimes not so willingly or in a pre-planned sort of method. And while states and territories and tribal entities regularly ask help from the federal government before, during, and after disasters, we've not had a state devolve since 1863 when West Virginia split off from Virginia during the Civil War. And let's not talk about the possibility of a US federal government devolution. But you may not know that each executive branch department and agency has a plan to devolve into some other federal department or agency internally. Your organization can view all of this CoopCog as internal or external. The sky's the limit.
Michael, can you go back to the consequence managed part? You know, the what ifs?
Sure. So when we discussed the differences between events and incidents, I mentioned consequence management planning. This is, quote, the what if planning part of emergency management. Lots of EMs plan for what they're going to do, when, where, how, etc. What they also need to plan for is what if. What if the plans don't work? What if the people can't make it to the disaster site to help? There are lots and lots of what ifs, and there are layers to them as well. The same is true for your organization. What if the power goes out in your office? What if the generator fails? What if you can't get it repaired or replaced? See how that works? The further down the rabbit hole you can go in documenting and hopefully planning for the what ifs, the better you and your organization will be. This gives you a plan B, a plan C, and D and E, whatever you can afford. And yes, every one of those plans costs money, even if it's in insurance premiums. And they cost time and require extra people and work. And if you're wondering what this picture is, it's my personal car. I got a cell phone charger, a cable, a holder for my phone up by the gear shifter, and that pink cable you can see is from my wife's iPhone. Down below, I have 3 battery packs and cables, 3 flashlights, a window breaker, a seatbelt cutter, plus a backup GPS. I try to cover some consequence management planning even in my daily drives around my town. Let's look at one facet of your operations, your interoperable communication systems, which starts with your phone system, your telephone system. In the context of what we're talking about with POETE, this is equipment, and you will use it before, during, and after disasters. So it needs to have planning elements, including consequence management planning for all of the phases of the disaster cycle. You need to be prepared to use your phone system to alert your staff, vendors, clients, etc. You need to make sure incoming calls get routed to your alternate location if you have to invoke your continuity plan during the response phase. See how this works? For the consequence management planning, you need to plan for not only what happens if your system fails, but what happens if other parts beyond your control fail. So if the landline fails, and for some of you that means what if the internet connection to your office fails, you need backups. If you have voice over internet but still maintain a fax machine somewhere, you might still have a copper line coming into the building. That could be a backup. Cell phones are obvious backups. We recommend surveying your staff as to their different carriers. The more the merrier in terms of consequence management planning. After that, you start to move into more costs with radios, and this can include some agreements and partnerships to share radios during disaster. Finally, there are alert systems which you can use, some through shared services with government and others which you have to maintain on your own or with other like organizations. Communication systems are just one set of equipment needs for EM. It's used within your incident command system and also by your incident command system to communicate outside of your organization. If your organization is deemed part of the government's essential activities and services, you may qualify for access to alternative communication systems such as GETS and WPS or FirstNet or other systems. Here's how this can be detailed out in your plans. There are 3 points to be made on this as an example of the what-if process. First, this is an activity to go through and revise the POETE before your organization, during the preparedness phase, well before the next disaster happens. Second, coordinate with your applicable government partners beforehand too. This will make it easier and safer to work through when those systems break down, and they will fail at some point in the future. And finally, there are costs to all of these, extra costs. But as Ben Franklin said, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. And that was back in 1736 when he was advising fire-threatened Philadelphians about how to prevent fires by joining volunteer fire departments and paying for something novel, fire insurance. Those activities all need to be done before incidents occur. Again, in EM, we view the world in 3 phases with 5 names. And don't forget, sometimes we're in all three of them at the same time, before, during, and after.
So do we need different POETI for the different phases?
Yes. Let's talk about your organization's before plans on an all hazards basis. This is where you will be in steady state. So in addition to the work you and your colleagues do to keep your organization going and keep the lights on and all that, you'll need to prepare to respond, get it? Prepare to respond to threats and hazards, as well as to help prevent them. Plus, protect against the adverse impacts you can't prevent. What does Smokey the Bear say? Only you can prevent forest fires, right? Well, you have to protect your organization from them as well and be prepared to respond, which means being ready to evacuate or shelter in place depending upon the specific situation at hand. Okay, so here's the one most people focus too much on, I think. Your organization's POETI to respond to hazards generated by threats. This is the during phase, which actually covers response and part of recovery. And just like the other two phases, this one benefits from a continuous improvement process as well. Plans for organizations who do not have an outward disaster set of missions have a self-preservation modality. In other words, save yourself. And there are really three decisions which can be very different depending upon where you are relative to the threat. They are evacuate, shelter in place, and either or both plus fight. Analyzing and exercising your response and recovery plans, including your COOP-COG, your continuity of operations, continuity of government plans, is something you should do at least annually. And then fix what you find did not go the way you expected during both exercises and real-world incidents. That's keeping agile. I mentioned recovery in the during section, and that was on purpose. Don't forget that the disaster phases overlap. Your response plans need to include the start of recovery efforts and how they're staffed as well. Recovery also includes restoring functionality lost during the disaster. And then there's the start of mitigating your organization to be better prepared for the next disaster. And the cycle starts all over again. Don't forget the massive impacts of a cyber disaster. Restoring files, even cloud-based data, can take time and effort. You need a plan B for what happens if you can't restore your production process in time or even at all. So this was a crazy amount of technical and conceptual material jammed into a short time. There's the obvious question of where do you go from here? Well, if you want our help in reviewing your plans and or exercising them through a POETI process, we can help. And we have a free checklist on how you can make a crisis action plan yourself. Just one part of your overall disaster readiness POETI. And for the folks who took the time to watch this presentation, we have a coupon code in the post or comments below, which you can use to get our crisis action plan, or CAP, our template for free. It's normally $10 an organization. My contact information is here, and you can also visit our website at bartondonot.com to learn more.
Hey, Michael, thank you so much for your presentation. I learned a lot. I look forward to hearing more from you.
Thanks, Todd. Really appreciate the time, and I hope folks take advantage of our offers. We really want to make sure and give everybody the opportunity, every organization, to have a crisis action plan. We think they need it, and whether we help or not doesn't matter. Everybody should have a plan and try to stick to it and continuously improve it.